This is going to be a follow-up to the video that I made the other week about Günther Anders' The Obsolescence of the Human. And it's going to focus on one very specific sentence in the whole book. It is the only time in the whole book that science fiction or fantasy is ever mentioned. And it is a dismissal. And it is such a curt dismissal of science fiction that I wanted to lift it out of the book and examine it and try to understand why someone would make a claim like this. So I'm going to read the sentence in question. It's on page 130 of the edition that I have, which is the only English edition. It was only put into print the other month. The full sentence is, when compared to the fantastical nature of today's reality, science fiction is in fact quite unimaginative. Now I thought about that at great length because I said to myself, who is going to call science fiction unimaginative? And the first answer that came to mind is someone who doesn't know a thing about science fiction. And given that the book was written in the late 50s, it's entirely likely that the view of science fiction that was prevalent at the time, even among fairly educated people, was negative. That most people thought of it as mere escapism, as newsstand pulp. And a lot of it was. The vast majority of it was indeed escapism and pulp. But there were a few examples that survive to this day of work that was a lot more imaginative and thoughtful and used science fiction as a medium to comment on our present moment instead of to speculate about what might happen. It was a way of talking about what is happening, what is continuing to happen, in a way that allows us to use fantasy as a distancing device to grapple with it. Now, everything I just mentioned, these are all relatively recent understandings that we've come to about SF. These aren't things that I think were, again, prevalent at all to any degree in the 1950s when this book was written. But I wanted to put aside the idea that Anders didn't know anything about SF, or that the prevalent view of SF was that it had no imagination, that it was just pure escapism and pulp. I wanted to think a little bit more about who would say such a thing, even especially if they knew about science fiction in general. Who would call science fiction unimaginative? If you look at SF as a way to escape from our current circumstances instead of transcend them, then it becomes easier to have a little more contempt for science fiction instead of respect. And what I mean by escape is that, it's the old SF pulp fantasy kind of thing where you're not really trying to talk about the real world in any way, shape, or form. You're trying to give people a way to leave it all behind and just indulge in something that will let them forget about everything for a couple of hours. Transcendence, on the other hand, is a lot closer to what the more adventurous and boundary-pushing people who are writing SF were trying to do. I'm thinking specifically of people like Theodore Sturgeon or Philip K. Dick, both of whom were writing at around the time this book was written, which made me wonder all the more about what would have happened if Anders had actually sat down with those guys or had some contact with them. I don't know if he ever did have any contact with the science fiction community as in any significant way, shape, or form. I haven't found anything to that effect. But I do maintain this stubborn little prejudice that if he had done that, he would have probably had a great deal more to say about it than just to say that it's not very imaginative, that the real world that we deal with on an everyday basis consists of phantasms and fantasies being acted out all around us in ways that would make science fiction cringe and shame. And the funny thing is that's exactly what Dick, for instance, was writing about, the unrealness of everyday life and how everyday life had started to resemble something surreal and horrible, and that the only way to really talk about that was not to write cheesy little riffs on it, to the degree that he did try to do that. By the way, he's written a number of works that would be called realist, and he wanted to be taken seriously as a writer of fiction with a capital F, but nobody wanted to publish those things, and so he fell back on science fiction as his main channel for doing that. So when Anders was saying things like science fiction is not very imaginative, he's probably reacting to, again, this very parochial view of it that was very prevalent at the time, and that wasn't where he really wanted to do his digging and his homework. I do have the feeling that if he had, he would have been rewarded with a way to talk about these things and with a different perspective. Although I also get the impression that the perspective he would have developed from it was that even the science fictional mode of trying to transcend this phantasmal horror that we've built around ourselves, where everything is becoming increasingly unreal, even the SF mode wouldn't do it. It would only work for a very small self-selecting number of people who, in a way, were already conscious of what was wrong and were just looking for some artistic or aesthetic reaffirmation of their sense of what was wrong. Yes, the world is messed up. Here is a very well-written short story that helps you believe in that all the more. So if I flash forward to today and I look at what's out there, there is a fair amount of SF and fantasy. I need to lump them together for the sake of this discussion. There is a fair amount of SF and F that is fairly brimming with imagination, and that is asking a lot of tough questions, and that is trying to do this in a way that will get its audience to wake up a little bit further, even an audience that seems already to be aware of the conditions that we're living under, to use the fantastic as a way to expand their senses of what's possible. But there's also a lot of it that doesn't even try to do that. There's a lot of it that is strictly and purely escapism. And the question becomes, is that a bad thing? Is it a bad thing to want escape in a time and a place where things just seem to be increasingly intolerable? And I don't think it's a bad thing to want escape under those conditions. I think everybody wants to try and find a way to balance themselves as much as they possibly can. One of the things that we've come to understand about neurology is that the brain is always trying to seek some degree of equilibrium and balance in order to function properly. And if you're in really dire circumstances, escapes into fantasy are often one of the ways to manage that. They allow us to regulate our sense of how to deal with things. If we have even a taste of how things can be better, even if it's impossible to have, then other things become that much more bearable. That's the theory anyway. But I don't say any of this because I'm trying to build an argument where I think that everybody who is consciously seeking things they know are total escapism are cheating themselves. I think that those of us who make things, however, have a responsibility and a duty to be conscious of the choice between offering escape and offering transcendence. And to the degree that we can offer people one of those things, to the degree that we can be entertaining, we should also strive to also be enlightening. I know that in my case, for instance, it's meant that a lot of the things that I've thought about as story ideas that originally started as something with a very heavy escapist slant to them, and that could have just been nothing but that, I looked at that and said to myself, that's not enough. I have to expand it. I have to get beyond the container that this lives in, because otherwise I'm not going to have something that I'm going to want to spend 18 months writing. I'm going to have something that anybody could have written, and I don't want something that just anybody could have written. I want something that I can sign only my name to. It's a tougher mission, but I think it's a far more worthwhile one. So when people like Anders are talking about science fiction as being so much less capable of imagination than just, a glance at the real world, I see what he's talking about. There's a germ of truth there. But to the degree that it is true, it is also surrounded by a lot of prejudice and a lot of unawareness of what the possibilities are with SF. And on top of that, I would like to do whatever I can on my own to ensure that whatever I produce doesn't get ensnared by that kind of criticism either. I don't give people reason to say, this is nothing but an anesthetic. Or worse yet, this is so decoupled from anything that I can connect with that I'm not interested in it even as escapism. So it's possible to go for in either of those directions. It's possible to be both too transcendent and also possible to be too escapist. There's a middle ground. And to the degree that I could seek that middle ground, I'd like to keep trying to do that. So this was a bit of a ramble, but I found it interesting to unpack it a little bit because there are so many individual sentences in that book that I think are spurs to great thought, and over time I'm probably going to keep pulling them out and talking about them. But I wanted to pull this one out and talk about it with you a little bit, see what everybody thought. And until next time then, stay curious.